Hello, I am YK Rao from FTI Consulting, and I have a question for Matthew. Uh, I am a chartered quantity surveyor, and I have worked in various projects here in Vietnam. And sometimes when I would negotiate, I say negotiate, but when I talk to the employer side QS about valuation of certain works, sometimes I find very strange differences in how one can calculate something so vastly different than how I would understand. Well, for example, I would mostly value based on SMM of Singapore that I am mostly familiar with. But here I've noticed in some occasions that it is really being calculated differently. So I wonder if you had any similar experience in your Vietnam matters that you ran into such problems as I did.
Yeah, I mean, Vietnam is extremely unique in the way it still measures variations. And it does go really back to simple first principles and builds up, which is really good. Actually, for me as a QS, I find it intellectually fascinating because it's the way that we used to do it in the UK years ago, before the time of design and build and international contractors coming into the market so much. Very, very simple principle. How long does something take? Add the material values, etc. Work all the way through. I think, yeah, compared to Singapore, definitely massive differences there in terms of value of variations. And I think also the amount of time it takes. So I've recently done a cost to complete on a power station in Vietnam. But I think we were coming around about sort of $2 billion to complete. And most of that was built up from first principle rates using the Vietnamese rate. What I didn't realize when we started the analysis was actually how regular those rates change. So for example, something like fuel, you'll have an element of fuel included in the rate. And because of the market changes in Vietnam, those fuel rates will change quite considerably, quite quickly. And those in effect will affect all of those rates quite quickly, and you have to recalculate them all. And I think also the other thing as well is also about what region you're looking at, because the Ministry of Construction set out the rates very thoroughly about different regions and what region has what. But I had it recently on a case where we had sand that was coming in, I can't remember which harbour it was now, but anyway, the region was a different region where the project was being built, but the sand was being brought into another region. And the argument around that was that you had to apply the rate for the region where the sand was coming into, because it was the most reflective region of the rate, not where it was going, because ultimately the cost has already been calculated of the extra logistical difficulties in terms of importing. So there's lots of subtleties around that I must admit, even being somebody that hasn't been brought up on Vietnamese rates, I must admit, it's been a learning curve for me, and I've certainly got to, I think, to a point where I can fairly understand it for being an international person. But it's something that I must admit is very, very unique to this market.
It's interesting that you said it's fascinating, but at the time it was very frustrating. But yes, it's a good experience. Thank you.
Just jumping on this question, Amit, what are your 2 cents about the differences in valuation in terms of delay or time analysis?
You mean in terms of different regions?
Different regions, yes.
I think what the one generalization I can make is that it seems that what has, the acceptability of various methods is changing over time and over different jurisdictions. So I showed you a few methods of analysis earlier on in a slide, and I'll take one example. So there's a method called collapse as build that used to be very popular in the 80s and the 90s in the US, particularly because a lot of the disputes in the US were related to projects involving federal government contracts, etc. And so that method allowed employers to get a better result. So that method was very popular. So it seems like methods have their own lifetime, in terms of half-life of when they are popular. And I'll give you another example, and then I'll come back to in terms of region. So that was in the 80s and 90s. And then what we saw in the 90s and 2000s was the advent of computer and computerized power over how you can manage projects in terms of schedules. So earlier, the schedule that I showed you was drawn on paper. and bars were connected on paper, and you would calculate critical path based on your paper calculations. And then once that changed, with the advent of computer, you could create schedules of 20,000, 30,000 activities, and that was a fascinating tool to use. When that came about, delay analysis changed. Delay analysis changed because now you could do the simulation-based methods. You could insert delay events and model it out. And the 90s and 2000s, actually, that was a very popular method in the US and then followed by that in Europe and UK, because it gave a perception of sophistication. But slowly, as we come to late 2000s and particularly in 2010s, well-known, well-regarded judges started to not accept those methods, and there were some critical judgments on modeling-based methods. So whilst that was happening in UK, for example, what we would see in Middle East and Southeast Asia is sort of with a time lag. So we still see those methods being used, like say, for example, modeling-based methods in Middle East and Southeast Asia, whereas those methods are almost out of favor now in the European and American markets. So what is interesting is it's how over time methods have changed and evolved, and how their acceptability in tribunals and litigation has evolved over time. And what we see in particularly in Southeast Asia is now it's sort of a commonality in terms of acceptability.
Thanks, Amit. Any questions from the floor? All right, well, I have this question, Matthew, for you. How do you see that variations or claims arrive differently in Vietnam compared to other countries? Just what do you think?
Yeah, I mean, I think the rates issue is definitely one. We were just talking about that a minute ago. I mean, that definitely creates a lot of disputes with international, because Vietnamese, particularly surveyors and engineers, have worked with that their whole working career. They know it better than anybody. International just aren't used to that. As I say, there's countries, Singapore, I don't think have ever really had it. I think Hong Kong's had elements of it, mainly due to more the British influence with the common law side. But we're particularly with the engineering side. I do remember doing a project in Hong Kong where they did build up from first values, but not first principles, sorry, but not seen so much in Singapore. So you do get, I think that's definitely an issue. I think other areas of variations as well, that, or maybe even the stress that I can see in the Vietnamese market sometimes at times is, interestingly, the rest of the world is really struggling with labour and inflation. I think Vietnam is definitely struggling with those two, but nowhere near anyone else. So inflation claims at the moment are huge in Europe, absolutely huge. Some of the projects I'm working on, we're talking about steel prices where they've almost gone up 3 times. And a lot of that's been obviously caused by the Ukraine war and other issues. Vietnam hasn't quite had that. I've not seen in the claims I've dealt with Vietnam, I've not seen big inflation claims, mainly because of the way that rates are controlled by the Ministry of Construction. And obviously that sort of constant benchmarking does deal with that. But the other one is also labour. I mean, as I said earlier, Vietnam has huge civil subcontractors in here that own huge volumes of plant. That you go to somewhere like Laos or someone else where they're building big hydro projects, a lot of these Vietnamese contractors are building these projects. They've got huge potential. And I think the problem again becomes with that international and Vietnamese change, because when you get a Korean contractor that's building something in Laos and all of a sudden you've got Vietnamese subcontractors, again, you start to see those disputes around the measurement and the valuation of the variations, because they're just not used to it. They're completely different. Korea is very driven more on EPCs, lump sum type contracts. Vietnam isn't. It's more traditional. It's more measurement based contracts. So again, you sort of get those differences. I think also the third thing I'd just say as well, when we talk about market volatility, is also one of the big areas, obviously with Vietnam as well, is it's got a huge power initiative with the PDPA, which is in the world is absolutely exceptional. I think Vietnam has definitely spoken volumes with the size of that program that they're rolling out over the next couple of years. But that is going to come with a lot of challenges, particularly on those levels. And one of them as well in particular is where Vietnam is at the moment with Russian contractors, because Vietnam still has a very, very close tie with Russia. It still uses a lot of Russian contractors. The problem the Russian contractors are finding is that due to OFAC, all of the equipment buying, which some of it's typically US, so General Electric supply most of the world's turbines. You know, they can't contract with them because of the OFAC sanctions. So it'll be interesting to see with Vietnam how that plays out, because that in particular is I think a big risk for how Vietnam is actually going to deliver these programs on an international level. And I think because of that, Vietnam will have to probably change some of those sort of ways of dealing with variations, and maybe have to evolve and upskill effectively some of its areas to be able to deal with that later. But in a way, what it does do very good traditionally, I suppose, in a way, the international countries also need to learn that, because in fairness, it's a very good system. It's very easy, you know, as an international to say, you know, you should change to an international standard, but actually equally, Vietnam operates what is a very, very thorough system, and trying to get international buy-in to that is going to be difficult.
Thanks. Is Mr. Trung?
I have one question regarding some. In fact, today's the General Agency on Construction Economics, the two key persons should join our conference, but they have their business trip to Europe. So, but we have our conference record and we share with them later. So, from your point of view as a QS, independent quantity surveyor, and also deal familiar with Vietnam system. So, any advice if you are now talking with the one who in charge of the estimation and system of the Vietnam for cost estimator? Any advice to them for the development so that Vietnam can be more close to international practice? Any suggestion, recommendation, please?
Yeah, I think one of them is possibly, I think things like NEC. NEC is very, very different to, as we're talking about on my presentation. And the principles around pricing under NEC is very, very different to the way it works in Vietnam in terms of looking at it as a perspective basis. And I think a lot of the rest of the world look at it in a similar sort of way in terms of how they price things. So I think having that different dimension to their studies or to their future learning, I think is definitely important. I mean, I think Vietnamese estimators or people that certainly understand the Vietnamese system have also a lot to teach the world as well. So I think it's circular. It's not all one way or the other. But I definitely think that learning about the different forms of contracts, how you value variations under, say, NEC, which is totally different to the way that it's done in Vietnam at the moment traditionally, I think is definitely, you know, good learning areas for people to certainly upskill. And I'd be interested to see where Vietnam later on go with NEC, because, as I say, there is pockets around the world at the moment that they recognise the values of NEC, and they recognise that actually it's a hugely successful contract, which it is. You see very, very few disputes in NEC. And actually, it's a hugely proactive and collaborative contract as well. So there's a lot to be said for that. It would do me out of work, but there's a lot to be said about it. And I think that in itself, that if particularly on these sort of scale projects, I mean, I always remember working on the London Olympics. And when we set up the London Olympics, the head of the ODA, who effectively reported into Boris Johnson, who was our Prime Minister for a while, he said to me two things. He said, this job has to finish at all costs. And he said, it has to be on time. He said, that's it. He said, that's as basic as that. He said, this isn't about disputes. We don't want disputes. And we put a DRB on the project, and the DRB was hugely successful. Now, of course, if you go behind the cost of the Olympics, I mean, it's off the scale. You know, it was huge amounts of cost, but that wasn't what the UK were concerned with. The UK were concerned about getting that finished. And I think with any sort of major projects that come into Vietnam, it's quite important to get that set up early doors, and how variations are going to change, how we're going to value it quickly, how we're going to move on with the job. I think if you get too entrenched in, we're going to have to remeasure this as per the Ministry of Construction rates, and that's going to take a year to agree, that just stalls the project. It just creates delay in the project. So I certainly think changing the mindset around being more proactive to price and agree things would be helpful.
Thanks. Just one more question.
Thank you. Could it be arguable that the very sophisticated approach which we have seen today as well, again, which comes basically from the English practitioners and the Anglo-Saxon world, had a very long tradition, and there is a kind of game between the courts and practitioners, courts and the practitioners, the feedback, while we, the civil law practitioners, don't have any tradition. If I look at my courts in Germany, there have barely any decision made on extension of time using such very sophisticated methods. I've had to learn everything from scratch. How many years do you have in Vietnam in experience with time for completion and extension of time claims? How many courts have ever had the opportunity to make a decision on that? Could that be a problem or a kind of a reason?
Yeah, I mean, I think, I would not, I understand that some of these methods have more prevalent in some jurisdictions than others, and you're correct. But I think at the heart of it, as worked through, I think most of that is, it comes across as sophisticated, but at the end of it, they are very rational and logical. The challenge, you're right, is having them accepted in different countries. And I think our impression has been that in Vietnam, for example, locally, neither the local arbitration center, which is VIAC, under which a lot of domestic disputes are going on, there is an understanding of delay analysis for that matter. And I think it would take time, there's no doubt. But I don't think this is more an issue of these methods being, kind of, how do you say, originate, any particular country or jurisdiction owns these methods. At the end of the day, a lot of the work that's being carried out in this analysis, when I've explained it to different practitioners across the globe, it's been quite acceptable.
I totally agree. It's the tradition, the amount of experience, the feedback from the courts, which is different, but the logic of these particular methodologies is brilliant, and we don't need even the courts, but that, I think, the problem that we do need more reliability from the courts, the feedback from the courts.
Absolutely, absolutely. And I think if, I think the hopefully the process would be that as more and more Vietnamese entities, unfortunately, or we get into disputes and they experience these methods, that they would bring that back into VIAC, and tribunals here and judges here would start to see that. I think we've seen that happen in other jurisdictions. We've seen that happen, for example, in Middle East, where in the UAE, for example, in UAE or Qatar, whereas once these methods were completely just not accepted at all in the courts and in the domestic arbitrations, now they're starting to find favor there